welcome to New World Witchery. This is a special Walpurgisnacht episode. It's just me tonight. Lane is not going to be joining us, but I wanted to share something with everyone that has been a part of my Walpurgisnacht May Eve, May Day tradition for a while now. One of the most important aspects of witchcraft, to some extent my spirituality as well, is storytelling. And so tonight I wanted to bring in one of my personal favorite stories to revisit on Walpurgisnacht Eve. So tonight I will be reading to you the story of the Horned Women, as recorded in Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry by W.B. Yeats and Lady Wilde. This version was recorded, according to the text, by Lady Wilde in a manuscript called Ancient Legends of Ireland. I will be reading to you the story, and then I will be discussing just a few little things in the story that have to do with the witchcraft that I do, in the hopes that it will be informative, educational, enlightening, or at least somewhat entertaining for you. So, if that sounds fun to you, please stick around. This won't be as long as a normal podcast, of course, but hopefully it'll be something that you enjoy, and if not, then feel free to turn the podcast off now and go find something valuable to do with your time. All right, I'll be back in just a moment. The Horned Women. A rich woman sat up late one night carding and preparing wool, while all the family and servants were asleep. Suddenly a knock was given at the door, and a voice called, "Open! Open!" "Who's there?" said the woman of the house. "I am the witch of the one horn," was answered. The mistress, supposing that one of her neighbors had called and required assistance, opened the door, and a woman entered, having in her hand a pair of wool carders and bearing a horn on her forehead, as if growing there. She sat down by the fire in silence and began to card the wool with a violent haste. Suddenly she paused and said aloud, "Where are the other women? They lay too long." Then a second knock came to the door, and a voice called as before, "Open! Open!" The mistress felt herself constrained to rise and open to the call, and immediately a second witch entered, having two horns on her forehead, and in her hand a wheel for spinning wool. "Give me a place," she said. "I am the witch of the two horns." And she began to spin as quick as lightning. And so the knocks went on, and the call was heard, and the witches entered, until at last 12 women sat round the fire, the first with one horn, the last with 12 horns. And they carded the thread, and turned their spinning wheels, and wound and wove, all singing together an ancient rhyme, but no word did they speak to the mistress of the house. Strange to hear, and frightful to look upon, with their horns and their wheels, and the mistress felt near to death, and she tried to rise that she might call for help, but she could not move, nor could she utter a word or cry, for the spell of the witches was upon her. Then one of them called to her in Irish, and said, "Rise, woman, and make us a cake." Then the mistress searched for a vessel to bring water from the well, that she might mix meal and make the cake, but she could find none. And they said to her, "Take a sieve and bring water in it." And so she took a sieve, and went to the well, but the water poured from it, and she could fetch none for the cake. She sat by the well, and wept. Then a voice came by her and said, "Take the yellow clay and moss, and bind them together, and plaster the sieve so that it will hold." This she did, and the sieve held water for the cake. And then the voice said, "Return, and when thou comest to the north angle of the house, cry aloud 3 times and say, 'The mountain of the Fenian women, and the sky over it is all on fire.'" And she did so. When the witches inside heard the call, a great and terrible cry broke from their lips, and they rushed forth with wild lamentations and shrieks, and fled away to Slievenamon, which was their chief abode. But the spirit of the well bade the mistress of the house to enter and prepare her home against the enchantments of the witches if they returned again. And first, to break their spells, she sprinkled the water in which she had washed her child's feet, the feet water, outside the door on the threshold. Secondly, she took a cake, which the witches had made in her absence of meal, mixed with the blood drawn from the sleeping family, and she broke the cake into bits and placed a bit in the mouth of each sleeper, and they were restored. And she took out the cloth that they had woven and placed it half in and half out of the chest with the padlock. And lastly, she secured the door with a great crossbeam fastened in the jambs so that they could not enter. And having done these things, she waited. Not long were the witches in coming back, and they raged and called for vengeance. "Open! Open!" they screamed. "Open, Feetwater!" "I cannot," said the Feetwater. "I am scattered on the ground, and my path is down to the loch." "Open, open, wood and trees and beam," they cried to the door. "I cannot," said the door, "for the beam is fixed in the jambs, and I have no power to move." "Open, open, cake that we have made and mingled with blood," they cried again. "I cannot," said the cake, "for I am broken and bruised, and my blood is on the lips of the sleeping children." Then the witches rushed through the air with great cries and fled back to Slievenamon, uttering strange curses on the spirit of the well, who had wished their ruin. But the woman and her household were left in peace, and a mantle dropped by one of the witches in her flight was kept hung up by the mistress as a sign of the night's awful contest. And this mantle was in possession of the same family from generation to generation for 500 years. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. It's not a very long story, but it's one of my personal favorites. I draw a lot from this book, actually. It's got all sorts of really interesting fairy tales that I've encountered both in this text and then in some form of variation, often in Appalachian lore, and I think that's really interesting. So, to go through this, I'd like to just hit on a few highlights, a few points that I think are particularly witchy. First of all, of course, the story is entirely about witches, which is quite witchy in and of itself. The number of women, you've got 12 women gathered together, each woman with a number of horns on her head corresponding with the number, the sequence in which she arrives. So you've got those 12, and then you have the mistress of the house, which makes 13. So there you've got basically a coven of witches. Now I realize that in the story, the mistress of the house is doing battle against these other 12 witches in order to win back control of her household. However, I like to interpret this story as sort of an initiation process. The woman of the house, she has to complete a certain set number of actions. These women are clearly associated with some sort of fate because of the association with spinning wheels, which each of them seem to have either spinning wheels or cards for carting down the wool to be spun. So these women are, in a way, they're helping this woman of the household fulfill her destiny. And in the end, she learns these spells to repel these witches, things like making the cake with blood, which is, or she doesn't learn how to make the cake with blood, but she takes the cake that was made with blood and puts it in the children's mouths and restores them. And I think that's interesting because that's, that sort of a spell is not all that uncommon during a certain period of history. I believe I've touched on that in one of my earlier blogs, and I think in one of our earliest podcasts as well. We mentioned in the Salem witch trials that there were some of the townsfolk actually made a cake with urine from one of the victims and fed it to the dog in the hopes that it would cause the witch who would put the curse on the girl into fits and torture her and reveal her identity, basically. So it's interesting. I think that that's clearly something that has some precedent in folklore. And of course, it sort of is its own precedent because this comes from folklore. But it's definitely a magical technique or something to that effect. Let's see. There are a few other things in here that are witchy. In certain branches of traditional witchcraft, the sieve, which is what the witches request the woman of the house to bring water in, the sieve is a part of the witch's tools. And then in other stories, there is a tradition about you would put a sieve by the door or even sometimes over the door handle because a witch could not enter your house. If that was there, they would have to sit there and count each hole before they could enter. So it was too much work, and so they would leave you alone. And I would sort of take that as if you put the sieve by your door handle, it wouldn't be so much that the witch had to count every hole as the witch would know, oh, this is someone who knows a little bit about magic, so I don't really want to mess with them. They might be able to do something back. Or it could even be one of the where it's sort of, not to get overly biblical, but could be a little bit like the blood on the doors during Passover, where it marks that person as one of the tribe. And in this case, a sieve might be sort of she's a witch, so we're not going to mess with her. That's just my interpretation. That's not necessarily something that it is definitely true, and you can take to the folkloric bank, so to speak. Let's see. Finally, one thing I love in the story is the spirit of the well coming to her assistance. Wells are often, very, very often associated with other worlds entrances. If you look at, for example, the story of Mother Hulda in Brothers Grimm, the protagonist of that story falls down a well after pricking her finger on a hand spindle, which is again a spinning reference, and enters into this other world where she meets Mother Hulda and stays with her and becomes her apprentice, and then eventually comes back to the real world with these fantastic riches and rewards. So what I take away from this story as far as the well goes is that the woman going through this process of initiation, these 12 women, they've taken her to a certain point. They've sort of hazed her in a way, but this other worldly spirit, who is well known to the witches because it knows exactly what to do to overpower their trick, and they even address the spirit saying, it's the spirit of the well that did this to us. So they know very well who has caused their downfall. So this woman of the house is then instructed from this otherworldly perspective. And I think that the combination of that sort of that hazing mixed with the otherworldly instruction, and then at the very end, the woman is given this sort of gift, that mantle that she keeps in the family for 500 years. Well, that mantle is probably sort of a symbol for her family line of magical practice. I'm not necessarily saying that, this is proof of an unbroken lineage of Irish traditional witches or anything, but it certainly helps me to say, she went through this process and has something to show for it, and obviously knows a little magic now. So I'm less inclined to doubt certain things about family traditions, knowing that this is coming from a piece of folklore, which is not necessarily trying to make any claims to witchcraft, but sort of symbolically represented anyway, I think. But that's just my interpretation of the story. It's not necessarily the absolute only interpretation, and every other interpretation is wrong or anything like that. It just gives me a lot of food for thought, and I really appreciate that. And it's just one of the many reasons I love incorporating these old folk tales, these old fairy tales, into my magical practice, because I feel like I learn a lot from those stories without necessarily having to have it spelled out for me in a step-by-step way. It's much more intuitive. It gets into me a little deeper. And so then, if I think, if I feel like, somebody's come into my house that I really don't like that they've been there, there are lots of things that I can do, but one of the things that instantly comes to my mind is I just need to wash my child's feet in a bowl of water, or even use a bowl of water to wash my feet or someone else in the family's feet, someone who lives in the house, and throw that out at the threshold. And if I do that, it's gonna keep that person who I did not want in my house from coming back, which is nice. It's a nice bit of magic to sort of have in my head. At any rate, that's it for this little mini special. This is not a full-blown special like with the witch bottles. It's just a little something extra. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope everybody's had a fantastic Walpurgisnacht, fantastic May Eve, fantastic May Day, fantastic Beltane, however you want to pronounce that. At any rate, I hope you are having a wonderful sort of spring awakening. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to visit the blog at newworldwitchery.wordpress.com or drop us an email at compassandkey@gmail.com. And we will be happy to hear from you and answer any questions if we can. That's it for today, and we will have another episode up for you here. It may even have come out before this one. If it doesn't come out before this one, it should be coming out almost immediately after. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed this, and we will talk to you again soon. Thanks so much for listening. Be well.